Well, I suppose this wouldn't be much of a podcast about woodworking and craftsmanship if we, from time to time, didn't come out to the shop and talk about tools, methods, just kind of in general what a woodworker does out in their shop. And that is kind of, one of the exciting things about getting into woodworking. So especially if you're a beginning woodworker, stuff like this is invaluable, especially for our generation. The ability to get online and see somebody that has gone before that kind of knows a thing or two about woodworking and see what their methods are for making their furniture and stuff like that is just incredible to be able to do. So I really, really hope to be able to contribute to that every now and again. And this is one of those days. And thinking about, where I kind of wanted to begin this section of the show that I'm just going to probably call either shop talk or tool talk or something along those lines. I was like, well, where is it that I kind of want to begin talking about tools? And I decided that I would start talking about really the tool that got me excited about woodworking. I can't remember if it wasn't the first tool that I owned. I owned a lot of different tools before I ever got into woodworking, but I would say that seeing this tool in action was really kind of what made me want to get into woodworking, because if you listen to the podcast that I had with Paul Simzak, you would know that I got into woodworking because of a gift that he gave me, and I really, really cherished that gift. And I wanted to know how it was built, and he kind of explained some of the tools that he had used and the joints that he cut to be able to do it. So I just typed in on YouTube, how to cut dovetail joints, and stumbled across this lovely man online who I would recommend anyone by the name of Paul Sellers. And I'll actually make a recommendation for his book. I think it's called Essential Woodworking. And if you are a beginner woodworker, or even a woodworker that's been doing it for a lot of years, and you just want to, maybe you've been doing but haven't necessarily tried to learn how to maybe do it better or do it at a higher level or learn what everything is called. It's just one of those things you're like, well, I just go out and work with my hands to get get away from the stress and the suffering of the world at large. Then I highly recommend that book. It's a great kind of beginner's guide to being able to build high quality level work with very few tools. And one of the tools that I was watching him work with while he built a dovetail box, that I was just like, that is such an incredible tool, and I would watch it in action. It's a tool that creates very little, or shavings that are very like paper thin shavings, just like this. And it's called a hand plane. And there are a lot of different types of hand planes, and they're incredibly versatile tools. So I decided that I would start talking about tools and what I like out of a good tool and the purpose of that tool, what makes a good tool. I decided that I would start kind of with hand planes. So, which I will warn you that if you are listening to the podcast, this will actually be a YouTube video that'll have a lot of different things going on in the side planes of the side view of the podcast. I'll even do like overlays over what I'm saying and everything like that, so that you can get a better idea of what makes of what's going on with a hand plane and all that good stuff. So if you are listening to it, you are going to I think miss out on the ability to see some of these things in action and know exactly what it is I'm talking about. But if you enjoy listening, then please, keep listening. So where I wanted to start was just discussing real quick what is a hand plane and what is its purpose. And this is a hand plane. This is in fact my favorite hand plane. It is a Stanley Bailey No. 4 hand plane. And I'm probably wrong, but with the very little amount of research that I've done on this, and just kind of talking to my friend Paul Simzak about this, we think that this hand plane is from about the 1920s. I could be wrong in that. If you are a woodworker and you kind of look into the history of hand planes and all that good stuff, and you think that it's older or younger than that, please let me know. But a hand plane is generally used, this isn't their only use, but generally they're used for taking a rough board or a log or whatever it is you plan on woodworking with in its more natural state. So a piece of rough sawn lumber would be a great example of this, which is going to have undulation in its surface. It's going to be rough. It's going to have the saw marks in it. It's not really ready to be worked with yet. We are going to use a hand plane to get that down to the right dimensions, get it, or in other words, get it square, get it straight, get it true, get it down to the right thickness, the right width, even the right length with a tool known as a shooting board. And then we're going to probably use a hand plane. It would have been common in old woodworking, or in older woodworking, they didn't really have sandpaper and stuff like that. So they would use a hand plane to actually get it to a smooth surface. So that's really what they are for and what their purpose is. Kind of the makeup of it is they're going to have a flat base of it, commonly referred to as a sole. They're going to have a handle, or it's also commonly referred to as a tote, that allows you to be able to push the hand plane into the wood. And then kind of the critical area here is, I don't know if you can see that or not, I'll kind of get a little bit closer here, is this area of the hand plane known as the mouth, where the blade, or what's referred to as the iron, protrudes ever so slightly. They come in all different shapes and sizes. They and the irons are not always straight. The soles are not always straight. There's a lot of different purposes for a lot of different hand planes and a lot of different types of planes that are out there. They have largely been replaced in woodworking, though not completely. It's just that when I started in woodworking, doing it only using hand tools, you would, like, this is where like a large portion of your work would be done, would be using a hand plane to get things down to the right dimensions, and getting it squared up. But when you look at today, it is remarkably quicker to use two tools in combination, known as a joiner and a planer, to be able to get your stuff down to its final dimensions. So power tools have come a long way in that particular regard, and I do own a 6-inch grizzly joiner, which is not necessarily something that I would recommend grizzly to anyone, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend a 6-inch to just everybody. Depends on what your purpose is in woodworking. My work that I do, I don't really need anything that big. Eventually I will, though, but I'll always have the 6-inch joiner that I'll still use for a lot of small projects. And then I have a 15-inch grizzly planer. So I have gone away from doing the predominant amount of my work with a hand plane and switched over to using big electric hand planes that can do the same thing remarkably faster. I'm not saying that they necessarily do it better. All I'm saying is that in woodworking, from time to time, you kind of have to make the decision of what it is that gives you the greatest amount of joy. And for me, getting boards down to the right dimension is not what gives me the greatest amount of joy. Marking out and cutting joints and shaping furniture is really what gives me the highest amount of joy when I begin to work with tools. So for me, it's getting the dimensioning out of the way so that I can do the things that bring me the greatest amount of joy in my shop, which is working with hand tools, cutting the joints. So So yeah, a good example of a hand plane that can do a little bit of everything. This is a number 4. Paul Sellers would say this is the go-to hand plane. This is kind of a argued back and forth thing, so I'll kind of talk about what makes a good hand plane, why you would choose particular hand planes for certain things versus others, all of that good stuff. What makes a good hand plane, I can talk about by kind of comparing and contrasting a lot of different types of hand planes that I own, which is why I have them all here. This isn't all of the hand planes that I own. So all of my hand planes are more modern style hand planes, though all of them that I use are really still quite old. But my point in pointing that out is that these largely iron hand planes, they were a controversial innovation. Woodworkers that were already master of their trade at the time wouldn't have really used a metal hand plane. Because I mean, why would they use something when they've already got this other aspect figured out? And they would have argued at the time that they're really not any better, and the reason for it is because of the metal. The metal itself means that it's going to create friction on the wood, whereas if you have a wooden hand plane, the argument there is that there is less friction and it is more of a joy to work with a wooden tool. So what you'll see people like me that use metal hand planes largely will have something like this, either a block of beeswax, which I also have one of those right here. All you have to do is just put a little bit of beeswax on the sole, and that will make that hand plane just glide across wood. Or you take a rag and a can. This is a trick from Paul Sellers, and you just wipe that across the sole of the hand plane, and that puts just a very... I've got a squirrel on my roof that's trying to pick on me through my shop. Maybe I should invite him in. But that'll put just a very thin coat of oil across that will make the hand plane really, really just glide across the surface of wood, and it doesn't hurt the wood in any way. It doesn't spoil a finish or anything like that. So yeah, all of these hand planes are iron hand planes, and all of them are also, except for this one, Stanley hand planes. So I'll just kind of quickly walk through them and then talk about the pros and the cons of them. This is Stanley number 110. It's what I would refer to as like a palm plane. It has a slightly lower angle, so it'd probably do pretty good cutting the end grain of wood. Because of the lower angle, maybe if I don't use this very often. It's probably one of the least used hand tools that I have in my at my disposal. But they can be nifty for just taking, putting very, very light finishing touches on something, or truing up the end of a board very quickly or something along those lines. I'll kind of contrast this Stanley number 4 versus this Stanley number 3. I really don't use this Stanley number 3. My wife does. So this kind of shows like how everybody's different and everybody has different needs in woodworking. She'll use a number 3 because she has small hands. And as you can see, the handle on this is very small in comparison to the handle on this. So I really never use a number 3, but my wife uses it. But a number 4, its handle fits in my hand very, very nicely. So both of these would be predominantly used for smoothing. They're not necessarily what you would consider to be a joiner hand plane, though you can use them for that. And when I started in woodworking, I did most of the joining, or getting the edge of a board along the length of its run straight from one end to the other. So we don't want this to have a round in it or anything like that. So you use different tools. The most important set of tools that you have there being your eyes. But you look at your board from end to end and see if it's way out of whack, and then you use a hand plane in order to be able to take that bow or that cup out of the wood so that it's straight from end to end. And then we want this edge of the board to be square to one of the faces of the board, preferably both of them. So that's what I refer to as joining a board, is getting its edge true to its face so that you can begin to work with it. That would largely be done by a longer hand plane. It could be this hand plane right here, a number 5, which is known as a jack plane, and that's because it can kind of be used for anything and everything. It's kind of the jack of all trades. A lot of woodworkers recommend this, and I would recommend it as well as your first hand plane. If I were to go back and do it all again, I might not have gone with the number 4 because the number 4 is super handy because it's smaller to be able to do anything and everything. So like I talked initially about how versatile a hand plane is, and one of the things that I like to use a hand plane for is putting a decorative edge on something, rounding an edge over, or giving the edge a bevel. And this can be quite cumbersome for that, but it's so nice for, because of the length of the plane, it is so nice for being able to edge joint a board or to get it straight from one end to the other. So a great hand plane is the number 5. And I guess I could point out that they go from in a standard hand plane from like Stanley, which Stanley and Record and a couple different hand plane makers that were out there. They largely kind of followed the same pattern with regard to the way that they made their regular hand planes. They went from a number 1, which really are kind of a collector's item. Some people who do like dollhouse making and stuff like that might use them, but they're not very common to see. Like if a person built an entire like human-sized table using a Stanley number 1, that would be incredibly impressive. But they go from a number 1 up to a number 8. I have here from a number 3 up to a number 6. So this is the largest hand plane that I own. I would like to have a number 7 or even a number 8, which are, I think a number 8 is almost 2 feet long. And they are very, very handy for being able to tackle bigger projects that are longer. And that is because you can true up the sole to being dead flat. That's kind of the nice thing about iron or wood, talking about wooden hand planes earlier, is that you can take something that is dead flat. A lot of people would use like a piece of glass, a piece of marble or something like that. I actually purchased one of these, which has been very handy, very nifty to have out in my shop, which is a dead true engineer block. It is dead flat to within 1/1000th of an inch, and it makes it to where I can take and put sandpaper on that, and if I ever want to true up the sole of my hand planes, I can sand the base of the hand plane to where it's dead flat, and then I can sharpen up my blade to where it is dead square, and then now I have a dead flat surface with a dead square blade that I can send across the wood, and that'll give me a very, very accurate hand planing experience, which is what we're kind of going for. So the longer the plane, essentially, and the more true it is, typically the better your work is going to turn out as a result of that. And then I just also have, kind of on the subject of getting things very true, I have this specialty plane here, at least I'd refer to it as that. It's an edge joiner plane. And basically, it is designed to ride along the edge of a piece of wood like this. And I don't know if I can get it to... Hey, I am getting it to take a shaving. That's cool. But yeah, it rides along the edge of a board, and I can set this, after I get it sharpened and cleaned up, I can set this to where it is dead square, and then like after I edge joint with a machine or with a hand plane that doesn't have such a sharp blade or something along those lines, I can take that hand plane and I can send it down the length of that piece of wood and take an incredibly fine shaving that will result in the edge of that board being dead true within probably 3 or 4 shavings with it. And they are a bit pricey for as small of a hand plane as it is, but it's an incredibly useful hand plane that I would recommend, especially a beginning woodworker own one. I think they're about $100 from Lee Valley Veritas, and well worth the money. So that's kind of a description of all the different types of hand planes that I have. What I'd like to do now is kind of contrast 2 hand planes very quickly here, tell you a bit of a story of what makes a good hand plane, basically. So both of these hand planes, as you can see, are pretty similar. And they are both, in fact, Stanley hand planes. They're both Stanley number 4 hand planes. And I remember watching Paul Sellers do woodworking, and he was like, you know, if I were to recommend to a beginning woodworker what hand plane they get, it would be a Stanley number 4. So I looked online, and I just so happened to find this hand plane, which is a modern Stanley number 4 hand plane. And I took it out to, at that time I took it out to a garage and started working on this to try to get it workable to where I could use it, and I never got it there. I'm not saying that you couldn't get one there. All I'm saying is that I did not, and that was rather discouraging, and was definitely the cause of a lot of angst as a beginning woodworker, that you know, I did what someone had said to do, I thought anyway, and it really didn't result in anything good. So what I found out of that situation is a very valuable lesson, is that not all tools are created equal. So you contrast this hand plane that largely has plastic and very cheaply made components, a sole that very clearly was not cast very well, and it's entirely too hard, which makes it incredibly hard to be able to get a flat sole. It's just flat out not a good hand plane. It didn't cost much. It only cost about $30 back when I bought it, but it was by far $30 too much, because I basically only use this to illustrate when I do like a woodworking lesson for my students. Through the years, I would bring this in and I would show them, because like a lot of people, they really do wind up using a hand plane like this, and they don't know what they're doing with it, and the results are obviously not so good, and it really takes away from the joy of working with a hand plane. And that's the thing that really irks me about the situation, is that, you know, your tools, in my opinion, really should bring you a great amount of joy. Like when you come out and you sharpen your hand plane and you get it ready to go and you start working the wood with it, it should bring a smile to your face. And this very clearly did not. I was frustrated and angry. So, and I already have a problem with my temper to begin with, so this did not help, especially early on. So I did some research, and I found on eBay the hand plane that I should have bought, and it was this hand plane right here. It was $96, so remarkably more expensive. And it was still in its original box, so that's probably why it was a little bit more on the expensive side, because really you can find these. I actually found this number for $25 in an antique mall, but it was not anywhere near as clean as this one is. So you look at just how much better made it is. Out of the box, it already came close to a finished form. Brazilian rosewood handle, brass knobs, very, very incredibly nice. Like I don't really quite know what they've got going on with this lever cap on this one, but a highly polished lever cap. A blade that's, or an iron that is already mostly flattened on its back to where I was able to get it sharpened up and polished and ready to go very, very quickly. So these are the things that we are looking for in a high quality tool that that's going to be able to produce high quality work. So being that I found that in this, and it completely and totally changed my woodworking experience, is definitely one of the reasons why I'm having this podcast today, is that you really do fall in love with these tools, because when you see what they can do, and when you see like the first time that you get a hand plane sharpened up correctly, and it casts these just incredibly thin shavings off the wood, you're just blown away by it every single time. It always brings a smile to my face. So those are kind of the differences. In other words, I would say that one of the biggest issues with regard to quality, or what makes a good hand plane, are predominantly metal parts. If you're going to go the metal route, or getting a wooden hand plane would even be better than buying some type of a piece of junk like this today. But largely what I have found is that if you're wanting to buy tools to begin doing hand tool woodworking, it's probably a best bet money-wise to buy stuff that was made before 1950. And that was when America and the UK began to ship a lot of their production overseas. And with it, not, saying anything negative about other countries, but just the quality of tools that were being made, they were made remarkably more affordable. Like I said, $30 for a modern hand plane, $96 for a hand plane that was made in 1920. But there is no comparison between the level of quality and the workmanship that went into this. As I like to tell people, when I pick this hand plane up and I put it in my hand, it feels like it is made for a person's hand that is going to be working with this for a long time. And the only way that it really can get to that point is if it was made by a person who would have appreciated that being the case. So, in other words, a craftsman made this handle to be comfortable because he himself knew that that the person that would be doing this would be doing a trade similar to what his was, which would be, shaping things to their final form. So, yeah, I really, really appreciate the craftsmanship that went into these. And really, you kind of can't go wrong. There's not much different between. You'll see slight differences. So this is probably an older Stanley hand plane, because as you can see, the lever cap on it just has this little groove here is just kind of a straight shot there. I'm not quite sure what they refer to that as exactly. Whereas this probably newer hand plane, it has I think they refer to that as a kidney-shaped lever cap hole on there, and the reason for that is because it makes it to where the lever cap doesn't come back slightly, as it might potentially vibrate across the wood, which won't make the iron itself or the blade begin to come back and start taking lesser and lesser or no shavings. So innovations that they made to these things from the late 1800s, we'll say, to 1950 largely made the hand planes better until they started shipping production for these things overseas. But, if you are wanting to buy, let's say that you have a good amount of money and want to get into woodworking and think that is a good route for you, and you would rather buy a hand plane, because that is the catch to buying a vintage hand plane, is that you are going to have some work into getting them ready. And that's that I think is a part of the mastery. So I even with the modern hand plane makers that are out there, I think that every woodworker really should buy at least one vintage hand plane and learn how to kind of get it up to snuff, as I have with several of these hand planes up here, because you learn a lot about working with the metal and working with the blades and sharpening and all that stuff from starting out in a non-ideal situation with regard to the tool. But if you have the money, and if you really don't want to necessarily have to have all that much work, you want to get straight to woodworking, and you want the least amount of time possible in getting a hand plane ready to go, to getting it ready to work, then there are 3 hand plane makers that are out there, tool makers that are out there, that I would highly recommend. I don't own any of them in just in a regular hand plane, though I do have plans of eventually owning some of one particular make. I would like to have a number 4, probably a number 5.5, and probably a number 7 or a number 8 from one particular plane maker. So these are my 3 top picks for modern hand plane makers. One of them would be Wood River. Wood River, that line of tools was greatly inspired by Rob Cosman, I believe. And Rob Cosman, but I would consider him to be, if not the greatest, one of the greatest woodworkers in North America today. He's from Canada, and you can get these around here. So that's why I would also kind of recommend Wood River, is that if you live around the Indiana area, and I imagine that there's probably at least one of these stores in every state in the country, is Woodcraft. That's Woodcraft's line of tools. So you can go into a Woodcraft store and buy, let's say, like if I were to recommend a hand plane for a beginner woodworker, it would kind of be a toss-up between a number 4 or a number 5.5, or just a regular number 5 hand plane. So the Wood River is of an exceptional, of exceptionally high quality, and they're very good tools. So that's one modern hand plane that would do the trick. The other one is the Lee Valley Veritas line of hand tools. I think they have standard angle and low angle hand planes. So low angle hand planes would be one that would do better on end grain, though you can use a regular hand plane to plane boards on their end grain. That's no problem. But if you want it to be easier, then having the lower angle would probably help out. Lee Valley, Veritas, any of their tools are incredible. The last, but certainly not least, this would be my number 1 pick, and it's who I plan on supporting with my business eventually, is Lee Nielsen. Lee Nielsen Tool Works. They're out of Maine, and they have made beautiful and incredibly well-made tools for quite some time now, and I cannot recommend them enough. Every time that I see somebody opening up a new package for a Lee Nielsen hand plane, just makes me green with envy. They are a really, really, really well-made tool, and I would really like to own one. And I think that I named those off in the order of their expense. So to give you kind of an idea, I think that a Lee Nielsen number 5 or 5.5. It's been a while since I've looked at this. They range somewhere between $350 and $500, depending on what you're getting. But if you enjoy woodworking, they are well worth the expense. But that's also why I wouldn't necessarily recommend a beginner woodworker. It would be a bad idea, in my opinion, for you to spend that kind of money on a brand new hand tool and then find out that you don't really like woodworking. It's a lot of hard work. It's a sweaty business. Sometimes getting something worked down to its dimensions, especially if you're going to start out doing things, only with hand tools. So because of that, my number one recommendation is always going to be buying vintage Stanley hand planes. And I am incredibly happy with all of them that I own, though I do have plans of owning others someday. I can't think of anything else that I wanted to necessarily talk about. This was just kind of meant to be more of a beginning, kind of introductory storytelling type of deal out in my shop. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I'll hope you come back and see the next time that I talk about these types of tools. And if you have any questions, please let me know, and I'd be more than happy to do like Q&As and all that stuff on hand planes and woodworking in general. Thanks. God bless.